Good morning. Nice to see you all here, especially with daylight savings time. I figured maybe 4 people would be here. I just found out about it myself last night. Well, how are you all doing with your Lenten goals? Those of you who have given something up, I'm not asking for a show of hands or anything, but giving something up to remind you of your daily spiritual commitment. Did you give up negativity maybe, or coffee, chocolate, alcohol, a little time each day to do some extra meditating or praying? It's a great way to remind yourself of your covenant with God. And that reminder is a concrete way to regularly validate to yourself that you are on a spiritual path. Now, unity doesn't demand, of course, that you give something up for Lent or anything else for that matter. We have no demands. But unity does offer the idea as a tool, a mission not impossible, to help you remember, if you choose to accept it, that you have chosen to be on a higher path, a spiritual path. And that is a very important reminder that you can give yourself. Good intentions, as we all know, are just great, but we need to remind ourselves often, because during the day, as things come up, we tend to forget and to go into automatic. And every time you don't eat that scoop of Haagen-Dazs, you remind yourself of your commitment. That covenant that you made with God to forego the Cokes, beers, lattes for a few weeks reminds you of your commitment on a regular basis. It's a great tool. And there is a definite stance in the Old Testament, too, about the covenant that was made with God and his chosen ones. The relationship of God and his chosen ones, his children. And that's all, of course, in the Old Testament, and where it talks a lot about a loving father trying to guide, trying to protect his children. Often with tough love. If you've read the Old Testament recently, I'm sure that it hits you a lot like it does me. If you take it literally, it doesn't sound like a very loving God. But he does all that in a literal sense to save the people. God is presented as a protector and a guide. He is seen as just but very exacting in his demands of absolute obedience. God demands that his children adhere to the covenant that they made with God. And God's part of the deal is that he will protect them. This image of God as Father was often later used by Jesus in the New Testament, too. Thus, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all adhere to this idea of a covenant, their covenant with God, which set them apart from the masses. A covenant is a promise to God to bless, provide for, and protect his children, and in return for their following his higher laws and values, he protects them. Some covenants were unconditional in the Old Testament, in the sense that God's promise didn't depend on anything that his children did or didn't do. Other covenants demanded that his children obey his commandments. The entire history of the Jewish people centers around God's covenant with the children of Israel and their descendants, that is, the Jews, Christians, and Muslims, the 3 religions that ascribe to and believe in the Old Testament. That's the history of our whole spiritual beginning. The history of the Jewish people, our spiritual forefathers, begins with a covenant that God made with Abraham. God said, "And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great," in Genesis 12. A number of years later, God made a second covenant with Abraham. God said, "To your descendants I give this land." In a later covenant with Abraham, God reaffirmed the promise of land and said, I will give to you and to your descendants after you all the land of Canaan for an everlasting possession. And about 500 years later, voila, we find Moses leading those same descendants of Abraham out of Egypt and through the wilderness in search of the promised land. God made another covenant with the Jewish people, this time through Moses. He said, if you will obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession among all peoples, and you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. It was because of this covenant that the Jews became identified as God's chosen people with a special mission in history. And don't forget that the Christian religion morphed out of Judaism, so Christians too are historically the chosen people in this contract. Now, I certainly don't think that some elitist anthropomorphic God chose one people to the exclusion of all others as the chosen ones, or that this wrathful God killed off millions so that these chosen ones could rule the world. But the story details are very important to review for other reasons, which we shall see. So, in the story, God picks his chosen people from the descendants of Abraham, like he promised. These descendants of Abraham are his son Isaac, whom Abraham offered to sacrifice, remember, to prove his faith in God, and then Isaac's son Joseph, and then Joseph's son Jacob, who we've been talking about for the last few weeks, Joseph in his magnificent technicolored coat. The Jacob who was sold into slavery by his brothers and then ended up in Egypt, second in command to Pharaoh, and thus in a position later to save his beloved father and to save his brothers from starvation. Jacob's 11 brothers and his father moved to Egypt finally. They had many, many offspring and multiplied until these chosen people, all descendants of Abraham, finally numbered 600,000 in Egypt. Then, after many, many years of slavery in Egypt, Moses leads these 600,000 slaves out of Egypt with God's help, and they eventually make their way to the Promised Land. Leaving their slavery and going to the Promised Land, the land of milk and honey, you remember, was part of the reward that God had promised to their forefather Abraham because of his covenant with the Lord. This covenant demanded that they follow the Lord's ways and obey the Lord's laws. And remember, after 40 years of wandering around in the desert, God finally delivered them to the Promised Land as he had sworn to do. But God demanded that they keep their end of the bargain within the covenant. And by the way, if you think that a covenant of giving up a few Reese's peanut butter cups for Lent is tough, go reread Leviticus in the Bible like I did to prepare for this and see what was demanded of those poor Jews. Well, so much for the history lesson. Let's look at what this has to do with you and Lent and our own spiritual development today. Remember that every single character in the Bible, every place, every event is a symbolic representation of our consciousness. The American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson, in his essay on history, said, "The whole of history is in one man. It is all to be explained from individual experience. There is a relation between the hours of our life and the centuries of time." Remember that the Transcendental movement was a major influence on the New Thought movement, of which unity is a part. Now, the children of Israel, who were descendants of Abraham, represent that part of our human consciousness that is seeking spiritual truth. You might say that they represent that part of ourselves that is searching, wandering about, looking for the truth provided by the relative world. The children of Israel represent that part of our consciousness that is growing and evolving spiritually. The three covenants that we have looked at represent three stages of our spiritual evolution. The Lord speaking to Abraham and to Moses represents the Lord of our own being, speaking to the leader of our own spiritual consciousness. In other words, your inner Moses is directing your spiritual growth, and this involves covenants. The first covenant of the Bible was between God and Abraham. The Lord said, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Our kindred, our country, our father's house, metaphysically represents all that is familiar and secure to us. They represent all those things outside of ourselves that we've become identified with. For example, we've become identified with our family roles, our career roles, our social and economic roles. This is our country, our kindred, and our father's house. These things are what Abraham's son Isaac symbolized. Remember, God asked Abraham to sacrifice his firstborn, Isaac, to prove his faith in God. Now, metaphysically, Abraham was asked to sacrifice his firstborn ideas and conditioning, these worldly ways, the ideas, prejudices, and conditioning of our lower self and the lower order of life. This was the case with the chosen ones who were told to leave their homes in Egypt. Egypt, remember, symbolizes materiality, lower order ideas. In other words, we are told to leave our Egypt, where we are slaves to our lower selves, so that we can go to our promised land. Notice that God doesn't always show the land to them right away. We must first leave our country, as in the story. The chosen ones had to choose to follow Moses and leave Egypt, where they had lived for many generations. These descendants of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph had to leave the world of materiality, their firstborn ideas, and follow their higher self, their inner Moses, to a better place, a better state of consciousness. And this is exactly what we must do. Follow our inner Moses out of our lower Egypt, that state of materiality, into a higher state of consciousness, our promised land. As long as we are identified with the safe and secure and familiar roles of our life, we may never get a clear vision of what a new consciousness or a promised land really is. Now, most of us seldom hear the Lord speaking to us as clearly as Abraham did when he was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. And even if we did, many of us would be very reluctant to give up everything we've grown so attached to and feel secure with, even though we're enslaved by it. That's why in the story, the Jews are shown as being very attached to their life in Egypt. After many, many generations, that's kind of normal. After we've lived a long time with our firstborn ideas that we got programmed with, it's difficult for us, despite the fact that we, too, are slaves to some of those ideas that make us suffer. We are all slaves when we let worldly values control us. We block our good, and we remain attached to the old, worn-out prejudices, negativity, and lower states. The Jews were secure in their slavery and their lower order of life in Egypt. They didn't initially want to leave. What happens to start freeing us is that our Moses, that still small voice within, is usually heard as a vague dissatisfaction or discontentment with life, a feeling of being empty or unfulfilled with life as we have known it. We may feel like the kind of person who could easily say, I don't know what I really want, but this sure ain't it. In the biblical story, that still small voice was a literal one, of course. It was Moses telling the chosen ones to leave what was familiar, Egypt, because it was enslaving them and it was causing them to suffer. Moses wanted to lead them to a better place, the promised land. Our inner Moses, our higher self, wants to lead us to a better place too, a higher level of living. But we have to commit to it, and we have to follow it. We must follow our inner Moses out of our inner Egypt. We must make a covenant and then keep that covenant for it to work. We must change our thinking, and we must make a covenant to do that. And we must remember that covenant every single day, which is why many people give something up for Lent, because it makes them remember every day that they have made a spiritual commitment. If you're feeling a sense of dissatisfaction or unfulfillment in your life, it may be a divine discontent leading you to something better, to your promised land. Now, please remember that everything I'm talking about is a matter of consciousness. You're not literally asked to leave your home, your family, your career, sacrifice your firstborn Isaac in a physical, literal sense. The promised land is not a geographical place. It's a state of consciousness. The land which we must leave is not a physical place. It's a place in our consciousness. What we are really to sacrifice, our firstborn son, Isaac, so to speak, is our firstborn ideas that we inherit from this world. And what we must leave is our emotional identification with anything or anyone outside of our higher self. What we are to leave is our old belief system that are man-made and grounded in materiality, our Egypt state of consciousness. There is something better and higher that will take us out of our slavery. Now, this is not easy to do because we're identified with who we are based on a number of things. It takes considerable faith to let go of the known for the unknown, even though we are enslaved by that known, as was the case of the enslaved chosen ones in Egypt. Now, Abraham represents our faculty of faith, and it is our Abraham, our faith, that makes this whole thing possible. This act of faith on the part of our inner Abraham, our willingness to sacrifice our firstborn ideas and prejudices, our Isaac, is often our first covenant with God. Faith. Abraham's faith and willingness to sacrifice his beloved son Isaac that he had waited for so many decades is precisely what led him and his future descendants to be the chosen ones. And faith is our point of departure on our spiritual path, a willingness to reach out for something better, higher, despite some uneasiness initially, and going into the unknown. Joseph Campbell calls that the hero's journey. The children of Israel, who represent the search for spiritual truth in ourselves, are our descendants of Abraham. which is our faith. It is our faith which starts the process of our spiritual growth. It is our faith that there are things higher than just the material world in life. For example, there's love, there's purity, goodness, truth. This absolute faith in God, Spirit, makes Abraham the very symbol of faith. Faith is always the first step. Our spiritual journey of 100 miles begins with the first step of faith. This is the kind of faith that it takes to leave our country, our kindred, our Father's house. That is our old ways of thinking and living and sacrificing our firstborn, our Isaac. The next covenant that God made with Abraham was the promised land. This was a very specific promise. The promised land of our consciousness is not seen as much as it is felt. It is in this place of our development that we gain a clearer sense of what our destiny really is. Again, this is not necessarily an awareness of something that we are to do in an outer way, as it is an awareness of an inner path and following that path. It is a clear sense of a higher purpose in life, to our life, and a willingness to make the commitment to seek that higher purpose above all else. This is what Jesus was referring to when he said, "Seek ye first the kingdom of heaven." The third covenant was the one given to Moses. He says, "If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my own possession among all people, and ye shall be a holy nation." In this stage of our spiritual journey, we begin to realize that we are the promised land. This is the phase of empowerment. This is the phase in which we begin to integrate spiritual principle into our human consciousness and to awaken to the truth of who we really are. We discover that indeed we have been chosen. We're the chosen ones. We've been chosen by the Lord of our being to fulfill a very special purpose. We're the chosen ones because we have chosen ourselves to evolve spiritually. We have made that choice, that commitment, that covenant. We find that as we obey the voice of our inner Lord within our higher self and keep his covenant, we are given new knowledge and new power because we're able to understand it. Henry David Thoreau, another transcendentalist writer and New Thought thinker, described it beautifully in his famous book, Walden. He says, "As one advances confidently in the direction of one's dreams and endeavors to live the life which one has imagined, he will meet with a success unexpected in common hours. He will put some things behind. He will pass an invisible boundary. New universal laws will begin to establish themselves around and within him, and he will live with a higher order of beings, the Sangha, others on that spiritual path." Thus, the promised land is not some magical faraway place. Neither is it a state of eternal bliss. The promised land is the state of knowing who we really are, spiritual beings with the means, wisdom, and power to overcome any and every challenge in our lives. We leave our Egypt and our slavery, and we go to the land of milk and honey. That's the point of the whole story of the entire Old Testament. It's the story of our growth in spiritual consciousness and how every single thing in our lives can be used to bring us into a deeper realization of our true nature. The truth is that we are each powerful, wise, and loving, free, spiritual beings living in a joyous and abundant universe. Often, though, we accept our slavery and unnecessary suffering. And one of the greatest tools which can often hasten our realization of our spiritual nature is to make and keep a covenant with our higher selves, with God. And this is how giving something up for Lent can help you do this. It is a brief period of time in which you can make a covenant with your higher self, your inner Moses. You can give something up for a few weeks, and this covenant can be a constant reminder that you are on the spiritual path. You have chosen to be among the chosen ones. Our sacrifice, our covenant that we make for a few weeks until Easter is a wonderful tool that can get us back into the habit of remembering throughout the day that we are among the chosen ones because we have chosen to be. The Buddhists have dozens of times a day when they remind themselves of their covenant to Buddha. The Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, they do prostrations 313 times a day, ideally. The Hindus have all kinds of similar rituals and sacrifices, as do the Taoists. The Muslims stop everything they're doing and pray 5 times a day to Allah. We at Unity offer the tool of a simple reminder of giving up something for Lent, a tiny covenant of sacrificing something that we ordinarily partake of to help us realign spiritually by remembering regularly all day that we have committed to our spiritual path, that we have made a covenant with God. And that is why the tool of a covenant is such a useful tool. It helps us remember. It will cut short our wandering around in the desert like the Jews did for 40 years. So consider in the little time left before Easter, before your spiritual resurrection, consider availing yourself of the Lenten tool of making a covenant to give up something that will help you remember regularly throughout the day that you are on a spiritual path. The struggle can help you grow tremendously. Jesus said, "I came that ye shall have life and have it more abundantly." And that's what I wish for you and why I suggest you're using this tool that's in your spiritual toolbox now, this tool of making a covenant with God, your higher self, so you don't wander around in your spiritual desert for 40 years. We all need reminding from time to time so that we know that we have chosen to leave our life of slavery to lower values in order to embrace higher values in life. So follow your inner Moses. Make a covenant with your inner Moses. It will be a great reminder that you are on a spiritual path and that you are headed for your promised land state of consciousness. Thank you.